Have you ever been labeled something so many times that everyone around you just accepted it as fact? At a family reunion in Dallas, Texas, a father raised his glass, pointed across the table, and said something that made the entire room burst into laughter. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. This one, he said with a smirk. The dumb one. The person he was pointing at was his daughter, Emily Carter, 27 years old. Quiet. Reserved. The kind of person who rarely fought back when people underestimated her. And according to her father, Robert Carter, she had been the family disappointment for nearly 2 decades. Now imagine sitting there at that table. Your brother is being praised as the future of the family business. Your sister is being congratulated for her new house on the lake. And then your own father publicly labels you the failure of the family. What would you do? Argue? Storm out? Prove them wrong? Emily did none of those things. She simply looked down at her plate and stayed quiet, the same way she had done hundreds of times before. Because in the Carter family, the roles had been assigned years ago. Daniel Carter, 32, the oldest sibling, was the star. MBA from Wharton. CEO of Carter Industrial Parts, the manufacturing company their father had spent 30 years building. Jessica Carter, 30, was the charismatic one. A fast-growing social media influencer who had just been gifted the family's lake house as an early inheritance. And Emily? Emily was the one everyone assumed would always struggle. Robert Carter, 62, never hid that belief. In his mind, only 2 of his 3 children had real potential. So when he joked about Emily being the dumb one, the relatives around the table laughed easily. Not because they were cruel, but because the label had become normal. Expected. Emily didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She just quietly folded her napkin in her lap and listened as the conversation moved on without her. But then something strange happened. A man in a dark suit walked into the restaurant. He spoke briefly with the manager. Then he scanned the room slowly, as if searching for someone very specific. A moment later, he approached the Carter family table holding a thick leather folder. He cleared his throat and asked a question that immediately changed the mood of the entire room. Is Emily Carter here? Emily looked up confused. She raised her hand slightly. The man walked over and placed the folder directly in front of her. Robert frowned instantly. What is that supposed to be? He asked. The man replied calmly. I'm here from Northern Trust Bank. This concerns Ms. Carter's financial holdings. The entire table went silent, because as far as anyone in that room knew, Emily Carter didn't have any financial holdings. But when she opened the folder and her father leaned closer to read the first page, his face slowly lost all color. Then he whispered something that made the entire room freeze. Why does this say you own $108 million? And that's when the real story began. What if the label everyone gave you was completely wrong? Not slightly wrong. Not exaggerated. But so wrong that one day it would make an entire room go silent. Long before that banker walked into the reunion, Emily Carter had already spent most of her life living under one nickname. The dumb one. It started when she was a kid. Growing up in the Carter household meant comparisons were constant. Her father, Robert Carter, believed competition made people stronger, so he turned almost everything into a measurement. Report cards, test scores, achievements. And in those comparisons, Emily rarely came out on top. Her older brother Daniel seemed like he was born ahead of everyone else. By age 10, he was winning math competitions at school. By 16, he was already talking about investment strategies and business models like a miniature CEO. Their father loved it. Then there was Jessica, the middle child. She had charisma, confidence. At 14, she was already doing small modeling gigs for local clothing stores and building a following online. Family gatherings often turned into highlight reels for Daniel and Jessica. Daniel would explain some new idea about scaling manufacturing operations. Jessica would talk about brand deals and follower growth. Then eventually someone would glance toward Emily. So, what about you? An aunt might ask. And the answers were never impressive. Emily liked computers. Not using them for social media or games, but taking them apart, fixing them, and figuring out how software worked. At 13, she started teaching herself simple coding from free websites. At 15, she built a small app that helped classmates track homework assignments. But to Robert, none of that sounded like real success. He once waved his hand dismissively and said, "Internet hobbies won't build a career." So the nickname stuck. The dumb one. And the strange thing was, Emily never fought it. She wasn't loud like Daniel. She wasn't charismatic like Jessica. Instead, she became something else entirely. Observant. While her siblings chased visible achievements, Emily spent hours online exploring obscure forums, developer communities, and open-source projects. Places where nobody cared about titles or family expectations. Only ideas. But the real turning point happened when Emily was 19. She was home from college one weekend, studying at the kitchen table, when she overheard her father talking to an uncle in the living room. Robert laughed and said something that Emily would never forget. "Daniel's going to take the company global. Jessica's building a huge online brand." Then he chuckled. "Emily? She'll probably end up managing a coffee shop somewhere." The words stung more than she expected. For a moment, she seriously considered quitting school altogether. If everyone already believed she had no future, what was the point of trying? But later that night, sitting alone in her dorm room at the University of Texas Arlington, Emily made a quiet decision. She stopped trying to prove anything to her family. Instead, she started building things they wouldn't even understand. She joined obscure developer forums, contributed tiny pieces of code to experimental projects. Most of them failed. Completely. But one conversation she joined in 2019 would eventually change her life forever. Because in a small online chat room filled with unknown engineers, someone introduced a strange idea for a financial technology platform. The project had no investors, no marketing, and almost no users. What it did have was a promise. Anyone willing to help build it would receive equity instead of payment. At the time, that equity looked completely worthless. But Emily said yes anyway. And that tiny decision, the one nobody in her family even knew about, would eventually trigger a phone call from a bank that thought a mistake had been made. Because 3 years later, that unknown startup suddenly became worth billions. And Emily's name was still sitting on the ownership list. Imagine being laughed at by your entire family. And less than 10 minutes later, a banker walks in holding documents that prove you're worth more than all of them combined. That's exactly what happened at the Carter family reunion. The dinner that night was being held at Lakewood Country Club, one of the more upscale venues in Dallas. Nothing overly fancy, but the kind of place families chose when they wanted an event to feel important. About 25 relatives were seated around 2 long tables pushed together. Conversations overlapped. Plates clinked. Someone at the far end was telling a loud story about a fishing trip. And near the center of the table sat the Carter family. Robert Carter at the head, naturally. Daniel beside him, discussing a new supply contract his manufacturing company had just secured. Jessica across from them, scrolling through her phone and occasionally showing cousins her latest brand partnership post. And Emily sat quietly halfway down the table, mostly listening. Then came the moment everyone would remember. Robert lifted his glass, joking about his kids' different paths in life. He pointed proudly at Daniel. The future of the company right there. More laughter. Then he gestured toward Jessica. And this one's practically famous already. More smiles, more nodding. Then he pointed at Emily. "This one," he said. He grinned. "The dumb one." The table erupted in easy laughter. Emily forced a small smile, the kind you make when you've heard the same joke too many times to react anymore. But only a few minutes later, the mood of the room shifted. A man in a dark navy suit walked into the restaurant. He spoke briefly to the manager near the entrance, holding what looked like a leather document folder. After a short conversation, the manager pointed toward the Carter family table. The man walked slowly across the room. People started noticing. When he reached the table, he cleared his throat politely. "Excuse me," he said. "Is Emily Carter here?" The conversation stopped almost instantly. Emily blinked in confusion and raised her hand slightly. "That's me." The man nodded and stepped closer. "My name is Michael Langford. I'm a senior wealth manager with Northern Trust Bank." Now the confusion spread around the table. A bank? For Emily? Michael placed the folder carefully in front of her. "I apologize for the interruption," he said calmly. "But we needed to confirm some documents in person regarding your financial holdings." Robert leaned forward immediately. "What financial holdings?" he asked. Daniel chuckled under his breath. Jessica raised an eyebrow. Emily herself looked completely puzzled. She opened the folder slowly. Inside were several official documents, printed statements, transaction summaries, legal notices. Numbers filled the pages. Large numbers. But Emily didn't fully process them at first. Her father, however, leaned closer to read. And the moment his eyes landed on the figure printed in bold near the top of the page, his entire expression changed. He squinted, then leaned even closer, as if the number might change if he stared long enough. Finally, he whispered something that made everyone nearby lean in. "Why does this say $108 million? Daniel immediately laughed. "Okay, what's the prank?" But Michael Langford didn't laugh. Instead, he calmly turned one of the pages toward them. "Earlier this week," he explained, "a financial technology company called LedgerAccess was acquired by a global payments firm." He paused. Miss Carter was one of the early technical contributors to that platform. The table went completely silent. Michael continued. "She received equity for her contributions. After the acquisition closed, that equity converted into approximately $108 million. Daniel stared at Emily. Jessica looked like she thought she misheard. Robert shook his head slowly. "That's impossible," he said. But Michael simply tapped the document again. All ownership records were verified. Then Daniel asked the question everyone was thinking. If she owned that much, how did nobody know about it? Emily finally spoke, quietly. "Because nobody ever asked." But the truth was, the money wasn't the biggest shock waiting in that folder. Because when Michael flipped to the final document, he revealed something about Emily's plans for the money that no one at the table expected. And when Robert read that page, for the first time in 20 years, he didn't look amused. He looked stunned. Most people think the shocking part of the story is the money. $108 million. But strangely enough, that wasn't the moment that truly changed the room. Because after the number was spoken out loud, something unusual happened. No one knew how to react. At first, there was silence. Then the whispers began. A cousin leaned toward another relative and murmured, "Is this real?" Someone else pulled out their phone as if they could somehow Google the answer in real time. Daniel stared across the table at Emily, trying to process what he had just heard. This was the same sister everyone assumed struggled with basic life decisions. The same sister their father joked about just minutes earlier. Now a banker was calmly explaining she had quietly become worth 9 figures. Jessica finally broke the silence. "Wait. Emily," she said slowly, "are you serious right now?" Emily shrugged slightly. "I guess so." Robert Carter, however, still looked unconvinced. He had spent 30 years building his manufacturing company from scratch. He understood money, deals, valuations, and nothing about this situation made sense to him. So he turned back to the banker. "When does she actually get access to that money?" he asked. Michael Langford flipped to the final page in the folder. "Well," he said, "that's actually what we need confirmation for tonight." He slid the last document across the table toward Emily. Robert leaned in again, reading over her shoulder. But this time it wasn't the number that caught his attention. It was the name printed across the top of the page. He frowned. Then he read it again more carefully. Because the account wasn't simply under Emily Carter. Instead, the document listed something else entirely. The Carter Future Foundation. Robert looked confused. "What is this?" he asked. Emily finally sat up a little straighter. "Well," she said calmly, "it's what I'm doing with most of the money." Now everyone at the table was listening. Emily explained that nearly $70 million of the payout was being placed into a long-term foundation. The goal wasn't luxury. Not cars. Not mansions. Not social media fame. Instead, the foundation would fund small tech founders who were overlooked by traditional investors. Developers. Engineers. Builders. People who had ideas but couldn't get anyone to take them seriously. Because Emily knew exactly what that felt like. When people think you're not smart, she said quietly, they stop listening to your ideas. Daniel blinked in disbelief. Jessica looked stunned. But Robert looked different. Conflicted. For 20 years, he believed Emily lacked ambition. Yet, somehow she had quietly helped build a startup worth billions and planned to give most of her earnings away to help other overlooked people succeed. Then one of the cousins asked the obvious question. So, what are you going to do now? Emily closed the folder slowly. She thought for a moment. Then she gave a small shrug. Honestly, the same things I've been doing. Coding. Building projects. Helping small startups. The only difference now was that people were finally paying attention. But the most surprising part of the night wasn't Emily's success. It was what her father did next. Because Robert Carter, the man who had spent 20 years calling his daughter the dumb one, looked at her across the table. And for the first time in his life, he didn't seem to know what to say. And what happened after that moment would stay with the Carter family for years.